Welcome back to the RBR Recap, episode 13. I am Alex Burgos. New setting for me, on vacation, but you know the grind doesn't stop. So we're hitting you with another podcast. I'm joined as always by my man, Gabe Rivas. Gabe, how are you, sir?
I'm doing very well. It's the upgrade episode. I think we're both making some good upgrades.
Yeah, some audio and visual upgrades. So you can see definitely and hopefully hear that we're trying to give you our best. So most definitely. We had some pretty good fights yesterday on Saturday, April 16th. We'll jump right into the first one, which was a fight on DAZN, promoted by Matchroom Boxing and headlined by Benn, the Destroyer, who going into the fight was 20-0, defending his WBA Continental title against veteran Chris Van Heerden. Now, this fight, when people saw that it was announced that Van Heerden was going to face Benn, it was kind of like, oh, okay, another, veteran that Benn should probably walk through. There were some arguments to be made that Van Heerden could maybe test Benn. But at the end of the day, I think what a lot of people's reservations were going into this bout kind of came to fruition. And so it didn't go, very long. Benn ended up trapping Van Heerden in the corner in round two, hurting him pretty bad, dropping him, and then the fight was called off by the referee. So Benn now stands at 21-0. He's in pretty good shape. He's one of the rising stars in the welterweight division, which is always a glamour division, an exciting division with a lot of top names currently, as we'll talk about in a little bit with Errol Spence. And then, those guys that are on the way up, Jerome Boutzenis, Virgil Ortiz, if he could still make that weight. So there are, guys on the cusp of being the next wave, and guys that we know that have been champions, are champions, and are at the top of even pound for pound lists. So, Gabe, I want to jump into the Benn versus Van Heerden fight, get your opinion on, what we could take from this fight, and probably more importantly, what's next for Benn.
Benn is a fun fighter. I've become a fan because you know what you can expect. You're going to get a knockout or someone trying to get a knockout. We saw it against Chris Algieri, and we saw it again on Saturday against Chris Van Heerden. So, there is developing a pool of young talents in the welterweight division. Jaron Ennis, Virgil Ortiz, and among them, of course, is Benn. And you're starting to see what these future rivalries for the belts are going to be in the future. Now, in terms of what's next for Benn, I don't know. They're going to have to be smart businessmen and make sure that he has some significant step-up fights that doesn't put him in too much danger. But at the same time, in all of us, there is a businessman, but there's also a bloodthirsty savage that wants to see some wars, no matter what age and what stage they are in their career. And I would love to see, this is a fantasy fight. We know this isn't going to happen, but just imagine a 25-year-old Benn versus a 24-year-old Virgil Ortiz. They're not even in their prime yet, but they're up and coming. They're hard. They're quick. They're known for their knockout power. I mean, in the 80s, you would have seen them fought at this young age. Right now, it's a different era. We haven't even seen Terrence Crawford versus Errol Spence yet. But I would like to at least urge listeners and viewers to, imagine what would happen between Benn and Virgil Ortiz Jr. right now. I would love to see that fight right now.
I agree. It's unfortunate because when you think about it, he's the, Benn being kind of like the feather in the cap of the welterweight division for Eddie Hearn and Matchroom Boxing. Virgil Ortiz, obviously the same for Golden Boy. And so when you think of them putting their best at this stage in their careers, it's just like unfathomable in this era of boxing. But like you mentioned, kind of when we're talking about like the Hearns and Hagler and, that era, I mean, those guys would have already probably fought 2 or 3 times amongst each other. So hopefully eventually it gets done because, we mentioned Ennis, obviously, Ortiz, Benn, and then, some of these other guys maybe on the cusp as well that, are a little bit older, but also still have a foothold in the division, would be good names. Now, I think Benn runs the risk, and obviously with his, promoter and everything like that, they're saying we want to get him a big fight next. It can't be one of these older guys that it's like I delivered a flashy knockout against, and then people are still asking questions because we can't really gauge where he's at with these types of fights continuously if they continue to do this. As we were talking about a little bit before, before we started the podcast, Errol Spence beat Van Heerden in 2015. That's 7 years ago. I mean, and he wiped him. He wiped the floor with him. So that was an impressive victory at that point. So I can't, without being too critical of Conor Benn, because he looked great, he did what he was supposed to do, but we need to see against someone else. And if you start talking about guys like Amir Khan, Adrian Broner, you still run the risk of having that criticism and being like, okay, cool, he beat a name, but that guy's past it. So he's in a tough spot to really show exactly where he is as a valid contender in the 147-pound division. So I guess it remains to be seen what Eddie Hearn means by a big fight.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize, I don't really think that would ever happen by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a fantasy fight, and you can imagine that in the 80s, these guys would have fought. And with Conor Benn, I mean, we mentioned Amir Khan, but I can't remember if Kell Brook has decided to retire. That would be a big fight. I know their last fight was with Boxer. It was on Sky Sports or whatever in the UK. A name, but like you said, any name like that of a previous era of welterweights is going to run the risk of saying, hey, you got to fight someone younger. And then another thing is that we mentioned 3 rising welterweights who are going to be the future of the division. They're each with different promoters. That is not good, because we're seeing in the welterweight division recently a fight between Munguia and Charlo not being able to happen because they're with different platforms and different promoters. You can already imagine that it's going to be hell to get these 3 guys in the ring in the future.
Right. And without running off the road onto another conversation, man, how fun would that be? Munguia versus Charlo. Gosh, it's like we're deprived of these big fights. And yeah, it's almost like you don't even want to talk about the future of the welterweight division because of that fact, because, they're represented by different companies. So hopefully in the future, different things happen where promoters are more collaborative. But I think, some of these guys, Matchroom and Eddie Hearn in particular has put fighters in position. We've seen it with Canelo. We've seen it with Devin Haney, where he's not holding on to their careers and not giving them the opportunities to shine. I mean, it's tough from both perspectives, from the fighter's perspective, from the promoter's perspective. And, you're trying to, at the end of the day, it's a business. You're trying to make money. So I understand that. But from a pure fan's perspective, yeah, we want to see him get in there, get challenged, and, really show us what he can do. And he's young, so we'll give him some time. But top performance by him, like we said, he did what he was supposed to do. Now let's see what's next. Also on Saturday, we had a Showtime pay-per-view bout presented by Premier Boxing Champions. It was a welterweight clash between WBC and IBF champion Errol the Truth Spence. His comeback after nearly 17 months out of the ring. He was taking on WBA champion HEERDEN Ugas in front of nearly 40,000 people at the AT&T Stadium in Arlington, Texas, capped off by an exciting welterweight clash between 2 champions. And both men really dug in, really showed the fighting spirit, and were not shy about throwing punches. Obviously, we know Ugas being Cuban, when you think of the Cuban school of boxing, the famed Cuban trainer Ismael Salas, who's in his corner, you may have a preconceived notion of guys boxing off the back foot more, moving around a lot. Ugas did not do that. He's stuck in the trenches and really, tried to dig in and win kind of like a phone booth fight. At the end of the day, I don't think that was probably the smartest thing for him, but, he tested Spence in ways and probably wanted to see, what he had left. There were a lot of question marks going into this fight with Spence because we didn't know only one fight since the car accident. And then the eye injury is just so many things that we didn't know. We didn't see if he was back to, his 100% self in that Garcia fight. And even he said he was about, I think, 80%. So against a guy like Ugas, we didn't know what he would bring to the table, but it was really a vintage performance by Spence where he worked the body beautifully. And he got his stoppage in round 10 after referee Lawrence Cole went to the ringside doctor. Doctor was like, Ugas can't see because that eye is closed. And so kind of saved him from more punishment. Gabe, what were your thoughts on this fight, on Errol Spence's performance, HEERDEN Ugas's performance, and also a question that most people are asking and discussing now on Sunday morning, what's next for Errol Spence? Obviously, you can't say Errol Spence without Terence Crawford. So that's a big sticking point and a big topic of discussion now. But what were your thoughts on this fight?
Errol Spence Jr. came to fight. Yordenis Ugas came to fight. 3 belts in a notoriously politically divided division were up for grabs. What more do you want? Errol Spence, I think it was his superior inside game, his the volume punching, his power that ultimately proved to be too much for Ugas. But like you mentioned, we saw Spence hurt in a way that we had never seen him be hurt before. He admitted in the post-fight interview that there was some confusion as to whether or not they were going to break the clinch. It was his fault that he got caught. But you got to imagine to yourself what happens if Terence Crawford lands a punch like that. With a fight like this hanging in the background, you're always going to be thinking about, well, what happens if Terence Crawford fights him, and vice versa. You're seeing, when we saw Terence Crawford fight Sean Porter, you're thinking, what happens if it's Errol Spence trying to cut the distance like that? But to go back to the fight, Yordenis Ugas showed that he has a lot of heart, that he's still a top welterweight. He showed it in the Pacquiao fight. He showed it in Errol Spence Jr. fight. So I'd like to see what happens with his career after this. But Errol Spence Jr., he's been a top welterweight for some time now. It's nice to see him capture 3 belts. It also sets up perfectly the Terence Crawford fight. You got to imagine what's going to happen in that fight. With Errol Spence Jr., he's really good at coming forward. He really knows, he's a true inside fighter. He knows how to throw short punches. He knows how to, when a fighter clinches him, how to put his shoulders down and really work from outside that clinch and land body shots and hit and shots to the head. He knows how to land short punches on the inside and dip his head on either side to avoid uppercuts. He knows how to cut the ring. So he's really a true inside fighter and does a lot of tricks that perhaps you don't see a lot of younger fighters do today. And so it'll be interesting to see him apply that to someone like Terence Crawford, who I think is a little bit more versatile. Not only can he fight on the outside, but we saw in his previous fights that he knows how to bang on the inside. He knows how to throw hard shots to the body and duck and counter to the body and to the head. He also knows how to fight on the outside, both from a southpaw and an orthodox stance. So if you ask me who I think wins that fight right now, I'm going to have to give the edge to Crawford because of his versatility. But who has the better resume right now? You got to say that it's Errol Spence Jr.
100%. Yeah, you said a lot of good things there, and I'll touch on a few. I think Spence's performance was really impressive. I thought against Danny Garcia, it was more of a tentative Errol Spence, obviously coming off of that accident, maybe trying to see what he had left in the tank or what he could put forward in terms of, his style. But he really went back this fight to the guy that we saw in previous fights, against like Lamont Peterson, even Kell Brook fight where he just really starts digging in, wearing the guy down, working the body. And it's just like, sometimes you don't get the full effect of body shots, but man, when he's working the body, he's putting everything into those punches. You're like, man, I would not be wanting to be standing in front of him, receiving those shots. And so the one thing I will say now, moving forward to what you're talking about, matching up Terence Crawford versus Errol Spence, again, a lot of times right after a fight, when a guy has an impressive victory, we start to think like, no one can touch him. He's definitely the best. I still think Terence Crawford beats Errol Spence, and it's for a lot of the reasons that you mentioned: his ring generalship, his IQ, his ability to switch stances, and to really, Vasily Lomachenko gets credit for this all the time. And they talk about the Matrix, and he's downloading the information, this and that. Terence Crawford is the Matrix. This man, you could see him just like progressively thinking, doing different things, really getting a feel for what the opponent does. And at the end of the day, I think Tyson Fury mentioned this on a call earlier this week with Dillian White. It's like, they're like, well, what are you going to do? What fight are you going to bring? You fought Wilder so many times consecutively. And he's just like, it depends what Dillian White wants to do. And that's what Terence Crawford does. Depends what the guy brings to me. You know what I mean? I'm going to go in there. I know I have the ability to do whatever I want. So depending on what that opponent brings, I can really craft my game plan on the go. And I don't think anyone does that better than Terence Bud Crawford right now. Let's not get it twisted. This is a mega matchup. I'm not saying Errol Spence cannot win. And I'm not saying that it's not going to be a competitive fight, but I just think Terence Crawford has the tools to really make it a definitive victory for himself. But I do want to give credit to Errol Spence Jr. with all of this, promotional crap that goes on in boxing. He has now cornered, for lack of a better word, but he's cornered the welterweight division. He has 3 of the major belts. There's only one left. So we know there's only one fight. Now, if this fight doesn't get made after this, there's a lot of questions, I think, on both sides, but you got to give him credit for, taking on the guys that had the belts, not easy fights. And now he sits as the WBC, IBF, and WBA champion. And again, there's only one belt left. It's a little bit easier from Crawford's standpoint and be like, hold on to my belts. You got 3 of them. I'm going to go ahead and beat you and just collect all of them. But man, that fight has been the one that we've been talking about at least since 2017. So you're really getting like Mayweather Pacquiao vibes. But I think we're going to get, probably the best from both guys. And I think right after the fight, it was pretty telling too. Derek James kind of like, whispered, he's like, we got to get back to the drawing board, back to the gym. Like he's already saying that after he stopped Ugas, because he knows they could be sharper, they could be better. And that's what's exciting too, because have we seen the best of Errol Spence? Maybe not.
Thank you for listening to the RBR Recap. Make sure to follow us on social media at RBR Recap and visit RBRRecap.com for the latest episodes.